This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 568 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. I know this is a football show, but I'm sure a lot of you are basketball fans too. Well, the NBA is back, and so is FanDuel's free over-under contest. It's simple. Just head over to FanDuel.com/over-under and choose either over or under for each listed prop. You can make free picks for a chance to win a share of $5,000. All you have to do is make your picks on FanDuel before every NBA on TNT broadcast for your shot at a big payday. Eligibility restrictions apply. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. It's a 15 transactions day. Let's get to it. By Javonte Williams. So a lot of you listening to this right now, you kind of know the direction that your fantasy roster is going in. Maybe you have 6 wins, maybe you're undefeated, and you know that you're looking towards the playoffs. You're looking to set your team up right for that playoff run. Some of you may only have 2 or 3 wins. In that case, you need to invite a little bit more variance onto your team. I would say that this recommendation is more so for the former. Usually when you have a running back in a timeshare who's coming off a game where he scored a touchdown, usually he would be a sell candidate. I mean, Javonte Williams' peripherals are not that great this year. He's one of 30 running backs with a running back rush share of 46% or better, and he has a target share that's still below 10% this year. But here's why I'm buying, and again, I think this is more for like the 7 or 6 win team. Williams obviously has just inherent upside if anything were to happen to Melvin Gordon. I think he'd be a fringe RB1. He might just be an RB1. And that might just naturally happen without an injury. He's a good rookie running back. He's flashed his tackle-breaking ability this season. Is it that crazy to think that if Denver is out of the picture, if Denver keeps losing, they just decide to use Javonte Williams more? I don't think it's that crazy to think that could happen. But here's the other thing. Once we get to the fantasy football playoffs, Denver is set up very, very well. They get Detroit in week 15, Cincinnati in week 16, and Las Vegas in week 17. That's one of the best schedules you're going to find for a running back. The Lions and the Raiders are top 6 teams for running backs in terms of adjusted fantasy points allowed, and Cincinnati is a top 12 team. So there are a couple of outs for Javonte Williams to sort of be a better fantasy asset. Melvin Gordon could get hurt. He could just see more work in general. And then the schedule itself lends to Williams doing very well in the fantasy playoffs. So if you're looking ahead, if you're planning ahead, I think Javonte Williams is a good buy this week. Sell or hold Joe Burrow. Now look, I get it. Joe Burrow's a quarterback. There may not be that big of a market for him. And if that's the case, just keep Joe Burrow. Keep him on your roster. He's not going to just disappear. He's playing very, very good football right now, but his statistics likely aren't that sustainable. Not this sustainable. Through 7 games, Burrow has an 8% touchdown rate. He's thrown 17 touchdowns on 212 attempts. Since the merger, among quarterbacks with 300 or more pass attempts in a season, that rate's been hit just 13 times. You can look at this a different way too. Burrow has 1,956 passing yards right now. Over the last decade before this 2021 season, quarterbacks have thrown a touchdown on average for every 161.3 passing yards. This season, that number's a little bit lower because quarterbacks have been more efficient. That number's 154.2. Joe Burrow is currently throwing a touchdown for every 115 passing yards. Again, it might be a little bit tough to sell Burrow high right now because I don't know if the market is totally understanding how well he's playing. But if someone in your league thinks that this is sustainable, that he can keep up this touchdown rate, I would consider trading him away. He'll be good from here on out, but we should bet on a little bit of regression. Buy T. Higgins. So as we know, Jamar Chase is absolutely destroying the NFL right now. And even though I just said to sell Joe Burrow, I am not selling Jamar Chase. I don't think Chase is going to be able to keep this up, but you don't give players like that away. You don't trade them away. And we know that Jamar Chase is incredibly talented. He was a 99th percentile wide receiver in my prospect model. But don't let this Jamar Chase season overshadow what T. Higgins is doing, at least from a volume perspective. Higgins dealt with a shoulder injury, and that sidelined him for a couple of weeks earlier in the year. But he's been seeing really good volume in this offense when he's been healthy. He had a 41.7% target share this past week against Baltimore. He's now seen more targets than Jamar Chase has when Higgins has been healthy. Higgins has out-targeted Chase 43-37. And that's not a knock on Chase. It's to say that T. Higgins, despite how well Jamar Chase has played, is seeing a ton of volume in this offense. The production just isn't matching yet, but it should eventually. Add Rashad Bateman. The waiver wire does not look very good this week. So that's forcing me to talk about a guy who I've talked about a lot on the 15 Transaction Show, and that's Rashad Bateman. He's still rostered in just 32% of Yahoo leagues. His last two outings, his first two outings of his career, he saw 6 targets in both of them. His target share in week 6 was about 22%, and that dropped to about 15% this past week. But even this past week on that lower target share, he was able to still catch 3 passes for 80 yards. He gave us a double-digit PPR performance. Rashad Bateman is incredibly talented. And as I've said on the show, although Baltimore is still a run-heavy team in total, they're more pass-heavy than they've been in recent seasons with Lamar Jackson under center. So Rashad Bateman should be rostered in way more leagues. Drop Allen Robinson. Honestly, I would rather have Rashad Bateman rest of season than Allen Robinson. Seriously. I understand that it might feel uncomfortable dropping Robinson right now because he has about a 23% target share in this Chicago Bears offense. But as I said on last week's show, I was going to wait and see how Robinson fared against this Tampa Bay secondary. It was a decent enough matchup on paper. Tampa Bay has had a beatable secondary. And Robinson came through with 2 catches, 16 yards, and his lowest target share of the season. Robinson's season high in PPR points is just 10.4. He's ranked no higher than wide receiver 47 in any week this year. I don't know how you can confidently play him. Even if he gives you a couple of good performances, you're still not going to feel that confident. So I think in a lot of leagues, a lot of 12 and 10 team leagues, you can drop Allen Robinson. Sell David Montgomery. So let's stick with the Chicago Bears for a second. David Montgomery is eventually going to be back from his knee injury. And I know that a lot of you listening to this, you've stashed him away. You're waiting for Montgomery to return so you can have an RB1 again. But I'm a little bit nervous. Khalil Herbert has looked very, very, very good. In weeks 1 through 3, Montgomery handled a running back rush share per game of about 88%. He had a 17% target share or better in 2 of those 3 games. The backfield was his. All the volume in that backfield, that was his. So if the offense didn't do very well, it wasn't as big of a deal because Montgomery was seeing so much work. But like I just said, I'm afraid of what happens when he returns because Khalil Herbert has looked so good. On Sunday, Herbert became just the 3rd back since the end of the 2018 season to rush for 100 or more yards against the Buccaneers. And even though he had that matchup against Tampa Bay, he now has a 50% success rate on the season according to Number Fire's expected points model. That's 8 percentage points better than what we saw from David Montgomery before his injury. Now, maybe this transaction is kind of obvious. Maybe there's not really a market for Montgomery after Herbert's performance. But this transaction is mostly to say if I were banking on Montgomery for the playoffs, I'm a lot more nervous today than I was 2 weeks ago. Add Kenneth Gainwell and Boston Scott. So at the time of this recording, I don't know exactly how long Miles Sanders is going to be sidelined because of an ankle injury that he suffered against the Raiders. He might not be sidelined at all, but he did leave that game against the Raiders, and we saw a split backfield between Boston Scott and Kenneth Gainwell as a result. Scott had more rush attempts. He had 7 rush attempts to Gainwell's 5, but Gainwell led the way once again through the air. He had a 25.8% target share against Las Vegas. I think Gainwell's the priority off the waiver wire this week, especially in PPR formats, but do keep in mind that Boston Scott saw goal line work in that game. He's not going to just disappear. This is not going to just be Kenneth Gainwell's backfield if Miles Sanders is indeed out. So add both this week and monitor this Miles Sanders injury. Buy DJ Moore. So there's a lot of chaos going on in Carolina because of this quarterback situation. And that's going to make people feel worse about DJ Moore. And it doesn't help that Moore's recent performances haven't been very good. He's been the wide receiver 49, the wide receiver 38, and the wide receiver 20 over his last 3 games. He's averaging 11 PPR points per game. Across his first 4 contests, that number was 22.4. Now, the good news is that Moore's work in the offense has not dramatically changed. During his first 4 games when he was playing really well, he was averaging a target share per game of 30.7%. Over his last 3, that's still been really strong at 26.7%. In terms of raw targets, he averaged 10.8 targets per game over his first 4, and that's been 10 over his last 3. So yeah, his volume's gone down a little bit, but not that much. And it was to be expected anyway. One of the main differences between the first 4 games and the last 3 is touchdowns. He had 3 touchdowns in weeks 1 through 4, but he's failed to find the end zone in each of his last 3. But he also was just converting better at the start of the season. And that coincides with Sam Darnold not playing very well. Moore's rate of seeing 15-plus air yard throws has actually increased over the last 3 weeks. 10 of his 30 targets over his last 3 games have traveled 15 or more air yards. That's a 33% rate. Across the first 4 games, he had 9 15-plus air yard targets out of 43. That's about a 21% rate. So here's where I stand. I think DJ Moore is an incredibly good player. And if you're a believer that Carolina's quarterback situation can't get that much worse than it's been, which I think is a pretty fair take, especially if they do end up getting Deshaun Watson, then you should be buying DJ Moore. Because touchdowns are naturally going to flow his way given the amount of volume that he's seeing in that offense. And he's still been decent enough in fantasy football despite the offense playing so poorly. So I would expect something in the middle between the first 4 weeks of the season and the last 3. I would not expect the last 3 weeks to continue. Add Will Fuller. So Fuller's eligible to come off IR this week, and the Dolphins could definitely use him, because over their last 3 games, Mac Hollins is second on the team in wide receiver routes run. They got to do better than that. And honestly, the situation in Miami for a pass catcher is not nearly as bad as you might think. On the season, the Dolphins are 6th in pass attempts per game, 1st in pass rate, and 5th in pass rate when in neutral game script situations. So if Fuller's able to walk in and see a 15%, 20% target share in that offense, maybe even more, then he's going to be a nice piece for your roster. And he's still out there in 71% of Yahoo leagues. Sell Elijah Mitchell. I like Elijah Mitchell as a player. I talked about him a lot on this show during both the pre-draft process and over the last month or 2. And he looked really good on Sunday night. He ran the ball 18 times for 107 yards against the Colts. And as I said on the mailbag episode last week, I do think he can produce as an RB2 from here on out. But I think he's going to be on the lower end rather than the upper end of that RB2 range. I'm concerned about his ceiling. And again, this is something that I talked about on the mailbag show last week. JaMycal Hasty returned for San Francisco in week 7. He had that ankle injury. And he had the exact same role in week 7 that he had in week 2 when he got hurt. He was the primary pass catching back. He played third downs, and he was the hurry-up back against Indianapolis. He had a 22% target share in that game. Elijah Mitchell didn't see a single target. And that's the concern. In 4 games, Mitchell has seen target shares of 0%, 6.7%, 7.1%, and 0%. What that means is that in order for him to be a huge difference maker in fantasy football, he's going to have to just go nuts on the ground and score a lot of touchdowns. I don't want to bank on that within this 49ers offense. Anytime there's a negative game script, there's risk that Elijah Mitchell won't be on the field. And San Francisco has one of the harder schedules from here on out, so they could face some negative game scripts. Not only that, but there's even more annoyance because Jeff Wilson's going to potentially return. And Wilson, like I talked about last week, he could steal some goal line work. That would be a massive loss for Mitchell. There's just a lot of things that could potentially work against Mitchell from here on out. And I'm not sitting here saying that he can't be an RB2, like I said. I just worry about the ceiling. I don't know where that consistent ceiling is going to come from. As a result, I think now's the time to sell. Add Brandon Bolden. I got it wrong. Last week, I thought Ramondre Stevenson was a really good add off the waiver wire. I even thought that he was a good deep play at the running back position. And then he was a healthy scratch. You know, in week 6, we finally saw Stevenson run the most routes out of that backfield. Just 1 week later, Stevenson was a scratch and Brandon Bolden played that Diet James White role. And I guess we got to look Brandon Bolden's way this week, especially because waivers are pretty thin. He ran the most routes out of the backfield for New England in week 7, and he saw 17.5% target share. In negative game scripts, Brandon Bolden could be viable in PPR formats. And this week, the Patriots are 5.5-point underdogs against the Chargers. Buy Tyler Higbee. Now look, the tight end position, it's rough. It's been rough all season long. If you feel a little bit stuck, I think that Higbee makes some sense. He's had a couple of down games this season in terms of target share. In one game, he had a 3.4% share, and another it was 5.7%. But in his other 5 games played, he's averaged a 17.4% target share per game with a low of 13.2%. Let me just put that another way. He's seen roughly 14% of LA's targets this year. That's a top 12 target share at the position. But that's also being weighed down by a couple of really low target share games. According to PFF, Higbee's run the 3rd most routes on the Rams this year. Robert Woods has run 23 more routes than Tyler Higbee. That's a little over 3 per game. Across the entire league, only 6 tight ends have run more routes than Tyler Higbee has. You have to sit here and think that that could eventually lead to more production. Or at least lead to spikes in production, which is sometimes all you need at the tight end position. Considering the offense that he's playing in and how his work could naturally see an uptick if there is an injury to one of the pass catchers there, I think he's kind of an interesting buy low option. Add Darius Slayton. So Kenny Golladay, Saquon Barkley, Kadarius Toney, Sterling Shepard, they're all banged up. And that allowed Darius Slayton to emerge in week 7. He played the most snaps at wide receiver for the Giants, and he finished with a season-high 28% target share. He had 5 catches on 9 targets for 63 yards. We'll see how things sort of shake out this week. We'll see which wide receivers are back, but I do think that Slayton is worth adding off the waiver wire this week in case those wide receivers are not ready, especially because the Giants get the Chiefs. Add Daniel Jones. And speaking of that Chiefs matchup, Daniel Jones is a decent streamer. The game against Kansas City has a 52.5 point over-under, and the Chiefs are 10-point favorites. We're likely going to see a lot of passing from the Giants. And Kansas City is a top 5 team in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks this year. They've allowed a top 12 QB1 performance in 5 of their 7 games played. So I like Daniel Jones this week, but if you don't want to go that route, you could look at Carson Wentz against Tennessee. Add the Cincinnati Bengals defense. So it sounds like Zach Wilson's going to miss at least a couple of weeks with a sprained PCL. That means that Mike White is going to be New York's starter against Cincinnati this week. And to be honest with you guys, I don't know if this is an upgrade or a downgrade for the Jets offense, or at least for a defense facing the Jets. Because so far this year, when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed, the Jets have been the best matchup for opposing defenses. Regardless, the Bengals are a good play. According to FanDuel Sportsbook, they're 9.5 point favorites, and the game has an over-under of just 43.5. They're a very, very strong streamer this week. The 16th transaction this week that you can't get in my 15 transactions column over on numberfire.com is to buy Zach Moss. This was a transaction from a couple of weeks ago. And then against the Titans in week 6, Moss came out and had his worst outing of the season. He scored just 5.9 PPR points. I'm an idiot. But honestly, guys, the peripherals were still pretty strong in that game against the Titans. Moss handled 61.5% of the team's running back rushes, and he had a 9% target share. That was good for 8 rush attempts and 4 targets. That type of running back rush share is going to come in handy over the next month. Because Buffalo gets Miami this week, then Jacksonville, then the Jets, and then the Colts. At the very least, their next 3 games should invite nice positive game scripts. And that could see Moss hitting 12 to 15 rush attempts per game to go along with some touchdown upside because he's the team's goal line back. You can probably trade bench assets for Zach Moss right now. And I would do that because I think he's got RB2 potential during this stretch. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the Weekly 10 Trend Show.